You're listening to The Heart of You on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, my name is Annette Deleu, and you are listening to The Heart of You, where we explore tools and modalities for your soul discovery. You will not only improve your relationship to yourself, but also your relationship with others on a spiritual, emotional, and physical level. Are you ready to discover who you truly are? Let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to The Heart of You. This is episode 55, and today we are talking about addiction and how it pertains to your spiritual awakening and how they are intertwined, how your spiritual awakening affects some addictive behaviors, as well as how your addictive behaviors can actually sort of hinder you on your spiritual awakening process. So I have the pleasure of welcoming Jenea Buhler. She is a clinical therapist, addiction counselor, Reiki master teacher, shaman, and astrologer. She has worked in the field of addiction and mental health for 20 years and has practiced Reiki professionally since 2012. Jenea, I would like to welcome you to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Annette. Thank you so much for having me. And I love this topic of addiction and spiritual awakening, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share about my experience.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's such a huge thing, right? It's something that I think a lot of us go through on our spiritual journey. So I would like you to sort of share with our audience a little bit about your spiritual journey and maybe some parts that are pertaining to addiction that you would want to share.
Sure, that sounds great. Yeah. And, you had mentioned all of the things that I do professionally. And I guess that my own spiritual journey is what has brought me to all of these practices that I've combined and the desire to help other people through things like addiction and different mental health issues. And I guess about my own spiritual journey, I always tell people that I think that as a child, I was very much awake spiritually. I grew up in an environment that was actually really full of addiction. I experienced a lot of trauma. And I remember as a young child, probably around 8, actually thinking about, wondering like what happens when you wake up all the way, what happens, and kind of knowing that there was something going on in this life where there was this bigger spiritual purpose and things that we and myself were like destined for spiritually. And knowing that there was something about this life that was actually going to make it difficult to get there, which I think are kind of, when you think of a child thinking things like that, reflecting on that really makes me think that I came into this world somehow still knowing that this was something that was really important. So, growing up in my life, I had my family actually are very like spiritually connected. And it's interesting that I grew up in a home that was like filled with addiction because, my mother was a medium and she did a lot of like spiritual readings and things for people. And so was my grandmother. And I was, growing up in this home where with these women, especially who were very spiritually powerful and also kind of stuck in the world of addiction. So growing up for me, I was always encouraged to be open to spirituality and to pursue different things and different ways of like being connected. And I myself had some pretty powerful gifts. I had the gift of, today it's like I am a Reiki master teacher. I teach people Reiki, but mostly what I would say is that what I teach people about is how to tap into their own gifts and how to grow them, how to also feel secure in them. Because when I was young, I had these gifts of being able to see the pain in people, being able to kind of see people's darkness, for a lack of a better word. And, I could, see things around people. And I knew that that wasn't normal in the world. And people like my friends let me know that that wasn't normal, that something was, not okay about that, or something was weird about that. And I was really afraid of the gifts that I had. They scared me. I saw things that were kind, scary. And so as life went on, I also then experienced a lot of trauma, and I actually found a lot of solitude in my own spiritual connection. At some point, I really started actually turning to substances to actually kind of dole out the connectedness that I had. And so I don't know if you know what I mean when I say this, but it's like when you are very like spiritually connected, it's a really high vibration and it's really powerful. And there's something about substances that kind of helps to dull that. And I say helps, where obviously, when you're going through a spiritual awakening, we want to wake up, we want to awaken, we want to step into that power. But I do think that there is a part of us that maybe feels afraid of that, and that sometimes that power, that knowing that the intensity of that vibration is a lot. And that was the case for me when I was young. And so I turned to substances actually to kind of dull that out so that these gifts that I had felt almost like they were intruding on me, and I wanted them to go away. So, that isn't necessarily what addiction did for me, though. I used substances starting at a really young age, and I still was, pretty spiritually connected, even during the use of my substances. I still did, different kinds of like healing with people. And it was I would say, not something that I would recommend doing, right? Using substances and, kind of in that realm of like spiritual healing. It was actually at about the age of 19. By the time that I was 19, my addiction. So, I think about there are a lot of different kind of levels to addiction and, the amount at which we really turn to those substances to escape. And mine was pretty severe. Like I used substances every day and I couldn't stop. And there's a lot about addiction that I think is really hard to make sense of because it is so terrible and there are, consequences that we don't necessarily like from it. And that's kind of where I was at. And I would say that actually it was when I stopped using substances that it was like those gifts and things that I had were really getting strong. Like they came back in a pretty powerful way that I felt really uncomfortable with. And I kind of shut that down for quite a few years in the beginning of not using. And so I would say that, in that way, like my story is maybe a little bit different than some of the listeners that you'll have who are going through the spiritual awakening and still using substances. Mine's kind of the other way around where, I stopped using substances and kind of tried to sort of push down that awakening for a while. And then actually when I had about 10 years without the use of any substances when I got a traumatic brain injury. That was really when I reawakened. It was like really, to me, I think of it often as like the universe just kind of slapping me and being like, this isn't where you're supposed to be or what you're supposed to be doing. And so that, I think about in terms of, even though I didn't use substances for 10 years at that point, the tendency for addiction was still very much alive in me. I, had turned to different things. Like I wasn't necessarily using substances anymore, but I used food, I used people, I used TV, I used basically like I was always like turning to try to find something to try to like take me away from what was happening internally. It was really like around that time that I realized that I had, all of this really long trauma history that I hadn't addressed and that I was, constantly trying to find something else to turn to in this like addictive behavior. And I realized that I really needed to do something internally. And what I want to say about that is, I think that the process of spiritual awakening is kind of terrifying at times, right? It feels so out of control. It feels so intense. It's like you feel so uncertain about like what is real, what isn't real, what's happening to me, and I think that it's essential actually that we really turn inward and address the things that are going on. And yet there's always, I think, kind of this part of us, and this is what I've seen in my own self and in the work that I do, is that there's this part of us that doesn't necessarily want to awaken. It's almost like we fight against ourselves. And that's kind of the way that I see that.
Yeah. It's interesting because you were mentioning that even after you stopped using the substances that you kind of, shifted to other things like sugar or food, television, that kind of thing. And it's something that I do want to bring up because in terms of anyone going through a spiritual awakening, you may say, well, I don't have any addictive behaviors or patterns if you're just looking at it from the standpoint of, drugs, substances, alcohol, anything like that, because it can be something that is like, your phone, Instagram, things like that. Like you could be escaping in so many other ways. I mean, for me personally, I didn't start using substances, but that was because I knew from a very early age that I had a really addictive personality. And so I smoked for a good part of my life. And that was my vice. So basically, whenever I would feel that grief or that pain or anything like that, that's what I would gravitate towards would be to smoke. Now, the interesting thing about your story is the fact that you had your gifts, like you had them at such an early age, whereas for me, like, I didn't. Well, I shouldn't say I didn't have them, I did, and then I shut them down because it terrified me so much. I shut them down probably, I would say, at maybe the age of 4 or 5. I mean, I remember specifically being terrified of a great many things when I was younger, and so I shut it all down. So, like, I didn't need to cover it up with substances because I did a pretty damn good job of, shutting it off entirely myself. So, people could be experiencing one or the other or a combination of both where, you're using the substances to actually cover up the spiritual awakening, to sort of slow it down, prevent it from happening, block it altogether, whatever it happens to be. But you could also be just sort of blocking it yourself, but then using the substances to cope with the traumas that you're not dealing with within yourself. So it can come from both angles.
Yes, and I'm glad that you bring that up because I like to think of addiction in terms of it being kind of a coping strategy. And, what I think about when you're saying all of that is like, we have a really great capacity as humans to cope with things. And so, it sounds like for you, when you kind of started to have the awakening, or like you were in tune with your gifts when you were young. And, one of the things that I think is really, I mean, there's something interesting about it. The fact that, we are such spiritually connected beings and that we would have gifts at such a young age, yet it's not something that we're really taught about. And I was lucky enough to grow up in a home where I was being taught by my family that that was something that was not necessarily okay, because it's an interesting sort of dynamic of what happened in my family with these women with these spiritual gifts who also felt like they were dangerous. So, I think that internally we have this amazing capacity to cope with things. And so we might do that by things like shoving things down, by, disassociating, and by turning to like some kind of a fantasy world, right? There are a lot of ways that internally we can cope with the things that are going on. And then I think at some point we kind of reach our capacity for coping. And that might be when we're, turning to some kind of something outside of ourselves then. I do think that addiction comes in so many forms, and I think of it as just it's a way that we're turning to something outside of ourselves to cope with what is feeling really uncomfortable internally. That might be trauma. That might be your spiritual gifts. I think really varies depending on the person. And in my practice, I see like a variety of those things. And, I don't know, there is something really interesting about, I just kind of, when I think about the way that, people will come in to see me, usually because they're really at like rock bottom and they're really struggling mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And what I see in them is actually oftentimes like these really amazing spiritual gifts, connectedness, highly empathic, and they're turning to different coping strategies or addictions to kind of disconnect from that because of because it's terrifying, and they don't know what it means. They're not really, we're not really taught about our energy or any of those kinds of things in this world. So, yeah, I see people turning to different types of addictions for all kinds of things. But I think just really simply thinking about it, like if when you feel really excited, what do you do? Do you pick up your phone to try to distract yourself from the excitement that you're feeling? When you're feeling, really depressed, are you turning to something that's going to give you a dopamine rush, whether that's food or a substance or whatever it might be. So, kind of thinking about it in those terms, like in a really simple way, I think that, we live in a world that is actually so full of addiction. And the phone is like a really great example of that. I'm glad that you brought that up.
100%. Yeah. We all have moments where we kind of feel stuck in our spiritual journey. For that reason, I have created a 2-day soul discovery workshop where we really start to tap in to those gifts that you have, discover those beautiful spiritual gifts. We access the Akashic records. We talk about how you can really understand and listen to your intuition and your guides. We do group work where you can practice these skills with others in a beautiful, divinely guided environment. If you would like to take part in this incredible healing work, I recommend that you head to my website and go to the store, and you can sign up for this personalized 2-day workshop in my apartment in Paris, right here in Paris. You can join me for 2 full days, and we are going to explore everything that you need to know about your soul. That is infinitesoullove.com/store. The next one is taking place April 15th and 16th, 2023. Are you trying to manifest your dream of moving to Paris? If you are, I would highly recommend listening to the Paris Estate of Mind podcast. It is right here on Paris Underground Radio, and it will give you everything that you need to know about renting apartments in the City of Light. We will be right back with the Heart of You after a word from our sponsors. Welcome back to the Heart of You on Paris Underground Radio. I often wonder if a majority of the world, like you said, is walking around with some sort of addiction in some way. And I don't mean that in the sense that it's debilitating for people, but I'm saying that in the sense that it is something that is distracting you from being present with yourself and being present with your emotions and where you are. And if it's uncomfortable for you to sit in silence with yourself, with dealing with a particular emotion, and you have an instinct to go do something in particular, that's your first clue that that might be your vice that you're using to sort of avoid what it is that you're really meant to be looking at. So when it comes to the clients that you have in terms of the addiction, do you find that there is a difference between people who are on the spiritual path who had these gifts in the beginning and maybe are trying to cover them up, or who are on this path versus somebody who is, as we would say, still sort of not awake in terms of their spiritual gifts and their awakening in that process? Do you find that there's a difference there, or is the sort of process the same in sort of treating that addiction or helping that person get out of that addiction?
I actually, what I've come to find is that the process is always in general the same. And I think that, obviously we're all very unique individuals. And what I love about the work that I do is really like showing up to really understand someone and where they're at and the things that they've been through. And so I would say that, each of my clients has been unique in some kind of a way, but in general, I think that the process is the same. It's, really about like what you were saying, being able to turn inward and, really going inside and looking at what am I trying to cope with? I'm using this addiction as a coping strategy. And so, like, what is it that's going on here? I would say that that is always the same, whether that's someone who hasn't awakened at all. I mean, generally, I would say that people who really haven't started to awaken and are stuck in addiction, that it is a little bit more at first about behavior and sort of altering your behavior. Where if you started to go through the spiritual awakening, it is a lot more about, going internally and looking through like what's going on inside of me and being willing to face things like your trauma, or one of the things that I think happens for most people, I've seen this over and over, is there's something about the authenticity of ourselves. Like, we've been taught in the world that like who we are isn't okay in some kind of a way. And oftentimes I think that this is really the heart of addiction. It's like trying to protect this little like vulnerable part that's like our authentic self from the world, from, whether that has come from some kind of a trauma, we're trying to sort of protect that. And so I would say that a lot of times, that and even with people who haven't awakened, it's still in the beginning, you're looking at the behavior. How do you stop using the substance? How do you find something else to replace that with, that I would say is more of a behavior that's getting you to turn inward, to bring your attention into yourself. But that really is the path, I think, to healing addiction, is like turning inward, sifting through these things in ourselves, like finding out who we really are, learning to accept, love, and, really like value who we are. And, to just, yeah, work through that stuff internally. And so that's always the path, I think, to freedom from addiction.
100%. And, I wish I had met you or known you like 10 years ago because it's one of those things where you don't really know until you've been through it. And, when I was trying to quit smoking, which I tried and failed many, many times, like I would quit for a year and then go back to it, and then quit for 6 months and then go back to it, and quit for like a few months and then go back to it. It was just a constant back and forth, back and forth. And in that initial stage, what I was doing was just, like you were saying, I was modifying my behavior. I was like, okay, so in order for me to taper down, I'm not going to smoke at work, or I'm not going to smoke in, going out with friends. I'm just going to only smoke in certain situations, and then eventually stop entirely, which I did, but it never really got rid of the craving or the desire to smoke. I always still wanted to smoke because the underlying issue and the reason why I was smoking was still there.
Right.
And it wasn't until I actually went through my spiritual awakening and actually, believe it or not, that desire to smoke increased and got worse while I was going through my initial parts of my spiritual awakening, like my dark nights of the soul and things like that, because there were many, because it was so difficult to deal with those emotions that I turned toward my vices even more. And then so it was smoking and caffeine. I was drinking copious amounts of coffee, and it was, yeah, I mean, it wasn't great in terms of like for my health and my body, but like ultimately it wasn't until I started dealing with those traumas and that feeling inside of me that was sort of creating the need to smoke. That's when the need to smoke actually disappeared, was when I finally dealt with those traumas. And so it's something that I'm curious about you and your experience, because your experience has been unique, obviously, in the sense that you had your gifts sort of early on. Did you find that when you went through the big portion of your spiritual awakening, when you were finally turning onto it, did the desire to use substances, did it increase a lot more during that time when you were going through that process of clearing, or how was that experience for you?
Yes, I mean that's a really great point, because I it's not surprising to me at all that your desire to smoke actually increased when you were going through your spiritual awakening. And, or that sort of those underlying symptoms of addiction were getting stronger when you're just focusing on the behavior. And that's why I don't do like I used to be super into like behavioral kinds of therapies, but what I found is that oftentimes makes those underlying things worse. And so what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. In my own personal experience, I didn't know that I was going to make it through that awakening without using. Like there were several times during that, because it is so intense. I mean, to face the trauma, the discomfort inside, having to face the truth of myself or things that I had done or let other people do to me, like, all the things that basically I was trying to protect myself from with these different behaviors and addictions just was like crashing in on me. And not to mention that I do think that as we're awakening spiritually, like what I was saying earlier, the vibration internally is getting so high and it's really hard to sit with that. And so I think that I want to say like, we need to expect that the desire to distract is going to come up as we're awakening. Yeah, that definitely still was my experience. So it is interesting to have, to like have been so awake for so long. I do think that I kind of really shut that down when I first quit using substances because it was so intense. So I shut that down with my own internal coping strategies. And so, the awakening that I had about 10 years ago also was extremely intense. Yeah. And I would say that I actually started smoking after 9 years of not smoking. I started smoking and quit and started and quit. I found, myself really just wanting to turn to anything that I could to not have to face what was happening inside of me. And it was ultimately, though, through that experience that I gained the ability to literally sit with anything that happens inside of me. It's like, it doesn't matter what's going on in my life today or, what is happening inside of me, that even when it's something that's like really challenging to sit with, that I actually have this really strong desire to sit with it. It's like, oh, like I feel kind of what you were saying, the desire to distract from that is gone. It's like I really, when something's like coming up, I'm like, oh, I want to, really make the space for myself to sit with this. And that's a practice that I have for myself every day. I mean, in my practice, I'm generally really busy and I have clients all day. I'm also a mother. And so it's like every day I set aside time to sit with me, to sit with myself. And that is time that I love so much. I love the time of just really understanding myself, knowing myself, listening to myself, where, that used to be terrifying to me.
Are you looking for a new book to read? Because I know I always am. Head to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio with your host, Jennifer Garrity, as she interviews fascinating authors that have a French connection. We will be right back with The Heart of You after a word from our sponsors. Welcome back to The Heart of You on Paris Underground Radio. Can you sort of tell us a little bit about the process between the points of having that intense desire to take part in substances or smoking or whatever it was at the sort of height of your spiritual awakening to where you are now? What were some of the tools that you used? What did you do in that period of time that got you from point A to point B? Because, when you're in the process, obviously, how you got there. But, for somebody who's listening who may be going through their dark night of the soul right now, who may be, partaking in substances and doesn't really know how to get to that space, what would you recommend? How would you guide them in that? So, kind of a two-part question, like how did you do it? And then how would you recommend somebody do it?
Yeah, I mean, how I did it, like what you were saying, like I wish that I would have had someone to help me through that process. I mean, I searched for people to help me and I was a huge mess. And I would say that what I found for myself that was like the best tool that I could possibly have was that when something would come up, some kind of emotion, some kind of memory, or even what I like to call the dis-ease inside, that I would like turn to something to ease that. Whenever that would come up, I would just say, okay, like just for this moment, I'm not going to distract myself from this and I'm going to sit with it. And I would say that, in all of the work that I do, that's really what I help people do, because I don't know if you had the experience of like just learning to do that is so challenging. It's so challenging to learn, how do we sit with ourselves? Like, even just probably some of the listeners are listening and thinking like, if I could do that, I would be doing it.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I found that, different, even just kind of meditations that are about connecting with your body, doing body scans was really helpful to me. One of the things that I found for myself was that because I had so much empathy and so much desire to help other people in my life, that like my energy was really dispersed. It was like out taking care of all of these other people outside of myself. I was like thinking about other people, and I was doing things for other people, and I was worrying about other people. And I really believe that, like, in the saying that says, like, where our attention goes is where our energy flows. And, as an energy worker, I really like to help people learn how to move their own energy with their attention, because that is, if we pay attention to that, if we look at where our attention's going, we can see that's where our energy is. And so for me, it was like really realizing that I didn't have very much of my own energy. And so I had all of this stuff inside, and I was giving my energy to everything else except for that. And so really pulling it in. I did a lot of, just sitting and really like paying attention to my breath and just calling back any of my energy that I could, disconnecting it from worrying about what was happening for other people, or what they were thinking, or what they were doing, or what they needed, and really turning it inward, which was a horribly uncomfortable process. It was a lot of that, a lot of crying. I believe that, like crying is actually very healing. And before that awakening, I didn't know that. I actually thought that we were supposed to distract ourselves from our emotions, right? Because that's kind of what we're taught in so many ways as children, is like, you got to do something about it. You have to, I think that's where we get this sort of, oh, this uncomfortable feeling is happening. I have to do something about it. So, yeah, there was a lot of that. It was just really hard and intense. A lot of times going through a spiritual awakening, you lose a lot of relationships in your life.
Yeah. It's almost a guarantee that you will.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And, people just kind of fall away. And oftentimes it feels like you have a lack of support. And I would say that that's one of the most important things in going through a spiritual awakening, is to have, some kind of support. But I think the kind of support that you have is actually really important, because it is important to have support of people who are open to what your process is that you're going through, and encouraging you in that process, not in what they think is the best thing for you. Or I don't know if that makes sense to you, but
It does. It does actually, because I think that one of the lower energies that we need to work through on this spiritual journey is shame and guilt. So,
yeah.
shame and guilt are a huge, huge, huge factor in addiction. I mean, I know that when I would say probably 70% of the time that I was smoking, I wasn't telling people that I was smoking. People didn't know that I smoked. I actually did it in hiding because I didn't want to be judged for it, you know? So, like, most of the time when I was smoking, it was at home in my apartment while I was crying. You know what I mean? So, like, it was, especially in the years before, they started banning smoking from restaurants and things like that. That was like, ages ago, obviously. That was more accepted. But then the more it became less and less accepted in the United States to smoke, like I started hiding it more often because people were so judgy about it. And what people were not understanding was that I wasn't smoking just because, I wanted to smoke. I mean, although that was the case, I did want to, but it was a deeper reason, right? So kind of clearing out that guilt and shame is hard to do if somebody is guilting and shaming you or they're judging you for what you're doing. So surrounding yourself with people who are going to understand where you are and understand that there is absolutely nothing wrong with you. Doesn't matter what kind of substances you're doing. It doesn't matter what kind of addiction you have. It does not matter. You are still 100% worthy of everything that this life has to offer. And if you're surrounded by people who are not supporting you in that, then it's not going to help you move forward and get out of that addiction.
Yes. And I believe that you actually just really hit on what I believe is the healing from addiction, which is, as I was saying earlier, that we have this little vulnerable part in us. And that's what we bury under that shame and guilt is like, we think that who we really are isn't enough, that who we really are isn't okay. There's like something wrong with us. So, that's why I think that it is so important to have people around you who are supporting you and loving you. And, one of the things that I do as both just when I'm just practicing Western therapy, which I don't, most of the time I'm using all of the techniques that I, have in my toolbox with people. But it's really about, showing up and hearing who someone is and being able to provide support and love to them and to show them that there is nothing wrong with them. It isn't that, something is defective about you. It isn't that you're bad. It isn't that so many people come to me actually also with this idea that they're evil. It's really so sad to me how many people come into my practice with this idea that they're evil. And if they really embrace themselves, that they're going to hurt people. And, you know, I think that, when you were just saying that you're worthy, that I think is really where we find healing and freedom from addiction is like, it depends. I've seen it go both ways where like some people will find that worthiness in themselves from themselves first. Oftentimes, though, we need people in our lives outside of us to also be telling us that we're worthy. And I think that that healing needs to come from kind of both directions, right? So, oftentimes people feel super alone going through a spiritual awakening and are being judged. It's not even just that you think that you're being judged. Thinking about the way that we live in this world where when you look around when you're out in the world, like most of the people that you're looking at are severely judging themselves. And so they can't help but to be judging you. And so I do think that it's really important that you have some kind of support going through a spiritual awakening. I see a lot of like things on social media about how like you're intended to be alone at this time. I don't necessarily believe that that's true. I think that it is very sad that that's what happens when we're going through a spiritual awakening. I don't think it's because we're intended to be doing it alone, but just the fact that so many people in the world are hurting so much and judging themselves that they can't really show up for you. But I believe that there are so many people out there, like people like us who have been through spiritual awakenings, who are really trying to show up and to support people through that. There are so many people out there. And I was lucky enough to actually have two really, really good friends who, they didn't understand like what was happening for me, but they were able to show up and support me with whatever I was going through. And, they knew all these things about me that I was like, well, unwilling to admit about myself already as my close friends. It was no secret to them that, one of my friends is like, I've just always thought you were a wizard.
I love that.
Yeah. So I think, that support is actually, pretty important, but definitely crying is
Yeah.
like screaming,
Yeah.
anything to really actually to move the emotions and the trauma and the pain that we have like stuck in us.
Yeah, and that is the reason for this podcast, quite frankly, is to allow people to have the resources that they need to be able to go through their spiritual awakening. Because like I was going through a spiritual awakening for almost 4 years and didn't realize that that's what was happening to me. I literally just thought I was losing my marbles. Like I thought I was kind of going nuts. It was scary, it was awful. It was really difficult, and it wasn't until I reached out and actually got guidance from the coaches that I worked with that it actually helped me to understand what was happening, to actually start taking steps to be able to move out of that energy. Because it basically just kept on cycling through, because the universe is going to continue showing it to you until you actually address it. And that's I was avoiding it. I was going deeper into sort of the things that were making me miserable, right? So yeah, it's super important, and I've always said this, like, I don't care who it is that you gravitate toward, just gravitate towards somebody, ask your guidance, ask your angels, your guides, anybody you want to talk to who's out there, say, hey, send me the exact right person who's going to be able to help me with this. And they always say, like, the right teacher shows up when you're ready for that type of work. Yeah, so I mean, from that standpoint, thank you so much for showing up and doing the work that you do, because it's so incredibly important to help people to understand that you're not broken, you're not damaged, you're not unworthy, that you can get through this no matter what. And as long as you have the tools and the right support, like, you can absolutely get through this.
Yes, I agree. And thank you so much for what you do and for having this podcast to help people understand that there are resources and there are plenty of people who have, walked this path, who understand, who are there to support you. And I love the idea that I think that, this it kind of goes both ways as a person who is like reaching out for help and as a person who is helping. So if there are people, listening who are coaches or healers and things like that, but I believe that we all have something very unique to offer. And it is in alignment with people who are needing that. And so I love that you're doing this podcast and that you're helping people to find the resources to make it through that spiritual awakening, because I think the process actually of a spiritual awakening, like what you were saying, it can be really dragged out if you don't have support or if you don't internally know what's going on. It just feels like you're getting wrecked. And, the difference in having support is that I've seen people go through an awakening so incredibly fast, where it's like they come in to see me and they're at their worst. And, it's maybe like 5 sessions later and they're just like on fire for life. And they are, pursuing the things that they're passionate about. And they're like really going after it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I wish that process would have been that fast for me. And I think that as people who know what that's like to be in that suffering for so long, it just is like, how could we not, show up and try to help other people through that?
Well, and in fact, I think that that's what we were meant to go through in order for us to be able to do this work. Because, yeah, I'm laughing because I've had the exact same experience. I had a client once who I'd been working with weekly for about 9 months. And at the end of it, she was just like, "Oh my God, this is amazing. And I can't believe it took me so long." And I was just like, "9 months? Seriously, hon?" I'm like, "This is record time." Like,
Right.
when I mentioned to her that, this has been ongoing for me for like almost 10 years, like, she's just like, "Oh my God, how did you go through that for that long?" And I'm like, "Well, I mean, it's hard when you don't know what you're going through, So the fact that you were able to move through this in this amount of time just shows that, you were ready. It was the right time. You had the right teacher. And I feel like the people who are sort of helping those who are awakening now, I think we had to go through that initiation process a little bit in a rougher way, so to speak, because
Yeah.
we had to go through those tough times to be able to really speak to what everybody else is going through and have some, compassion and empathy and know how to guide them through, right? So it's, I look at it all as a gift because of that, because I think that had I not gone through all those things, I would not be able to help the people that I'm helping now. And then also, I think likewise, I would imagine you would probably say the same. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, definitely. I think that it really is because of, the experiences that I had and it being so challenging that I mean, I love what I do so much today. It's like just to see people go through the process of their awakening and step into their authentic selves and like really, it's like stepping out of the suffering of this world into the beauty of like being a human being. And like it makes that all that suffering that I went through really worth it to be able to guide people on that journey.
Yeah, definitely. I love Paris for all of its myriad of options of things to do throughout each and every day. However, it can get a little overwhelming sometimes to figure out what you want to do because there's so much to do. If you're in this position, I highly recommend you listen to Don't Miss This with Jennifer Garrity. She gives you the best of the best of what is going on in Paris for each particular week. It is definitely something I listen to every Sunday, so go and check it out at parisundergroundradio.com. We will be right back with The Heart of You after a word from our sponsors. Welcome back to The Heart of You on Paris Underground Radio. So now, if somebody is out there and they're going through their spiritual awakening and they reach out for help and they're saying, okay, I'm ready. I really want to work with Jenea, and you start working with a particular client, the process in which you utilize to get them to the place of being able to use the tools to be able to turn within and sit with themselves and go through the emotions, is it a process where you are very much like hard and fast, like you have to stop the addiction now? Or is it like you allow them to sort of wean off the addiction as it goes forward, as the healing goes forward? What is your process in that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. To me, actually, I never tell people what they have to do. I really believe that each of us kind of has our own process and that it's that way for a reason. And so I work with plenty of people who will stop the addiction right away. I work with plenty of people who continue on with the addiction. And one of the things that I tell people is like, if you are using a substance or turning to some kind of an addiction, if you are just doing the things that I'm teaching, if you are, and we do them actually in session, it's not like I'm sending you off to go do these things for homework, although that's definitely something I'll recommend. But we're actually doing them in session. And the more that you are doing these things, like getting to know yourself and sitting through those things, the less that you really even have the desire to turn to those addictions. And so it's never really like hard and fast. I do tell people, like if you are using a substance, that I don't want you to come into session on a substance, because that actually sort of, in a session, we're using energy and different things that actually are meant to raise your vibration while we're in a session. And if you're doling that out with a substance, it isn't going to have the same effect. So that's really the thing that I ask. I think that the process isn't the same for everyone as far as like how they move through that addiction.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I was asking that question is because I think that sometimes if somebody is not ready to get over an addiction yet, let's say, like they're not ready to let it go yet, going to some sort of rehab treatment or going to, let's say, AA or any NA, Narcotics Anonymous, any of those things, like you have to walk in the door and you have to make the agreement that you're going to stop using immediately. And for some people, that might not be the way for them to move through the addiction, right? So, this is another alternative for people who are maybe also not ready to do that yet, but they need to take the first steps in order to start the healing. So, I wanted to make sure people knew that about you and about how you're working, because it is important, because I think a lot of people might not try to get help because they think it's an all or nothing thing, and it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for addressing that. And, one of the things that I think about is the way that when, if you are using a substance or like whatever it is that you're using addictively, that when you take that away, that's when all of your stuff really comes up, right? And so
Mhm.
things get worse when you take away whatever that coping strategy is. And so honestly, I just in the beginning of working with someone who isn't feeling like they can walk away from that addiction or stop whatever that behavior is, what we would do first is actually try to find some other coping strategies and start inserting those in little ways in place of the addiction, whatever it is that you're turning to. And that is, because actually I think that it can be sometimes even harmful, mentally, to just completely take away that substance. Like that would be different, I would say, if you're in a treatment center or, somewhere that really has the support for taking away that substance to support you through whatever it is that happens.
Right. And you're speaking physically as well, yeah.
Oh yes, physically. I was mostly actually talking about mentally and emotionally, but physically as well, yes.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, depending on what your addiction is, it can affect your body in different ways.
It can be dangerous, especially with alcohol or things like different types of downers and things.
Right. Okay. So if somebody would like to work with you, how would they go about doing that?
Sure. They could contact me through my website. So that's energyrising1111.com. I offer a variety of different ways of working with people, kind of depending on where they're at. I do different spiritual coaching, working with people who are facing addiction or mental health issues. So, yeah, they can find all that information on my website.
And you're taking one on one clients, correct?
I am, yes.
Wonderful. Okay. How can people find you on social media if you have any updates for events and things like that?
Yeah, I have been a little bit slow to to get on social media platforms. I do currently have a Facebook page. So the same, just look up Energy Rising 1111 and the same on Instagram. And I'm actually just kind of starting on, using social media platforms, and Instagram is probably where I'm going to be having the most updates and different like how to kinds of videos and tips.
Fantastic. Janae, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been super helpful, I think, for people who might be, sort of leaning towards reaching out, potentially wanting to make some changes in their lives. And I think it's super important, the work that you're doing. And thank you so much for showing up and doing it.
Yeah, thank you as well. Thank you for all that you do and for having this podcast and the ways that you're helping the collective in this journey.
Okay, so for those of you who would like to contact Janae, again, you can go to Energy Rising 1111. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can always reach me at infinitesoullove.com. I'm also on all social media. That would be TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, as well as YouTube at Infinite Soul Love 1111.
This episode of The Heart of You was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, please join us on Patreon.